Morning, another day, another real world test. Today we're doing on the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV. And we're going to talk about some of the things that I like and don't like about it while we explore today as usual. But first things first.
Hey, how's it going?
Coffee, check. And this is a cafe called Maglia Rosa.
It was started by someone who grew up in Milan and used to watch bike racing on TV in the 70s, and then worked in fashion and design for over 15 years. Now they eventually moved to New York City and they started Maglia Rosa. Now the Red Hook location is actually a custom handmade bike store, while this location is part bar, part Milan cafe with cycling apparel and a self-service tune-up station as well. It's a really nice spot to just like sit and work or just sip a latte and pretend you're in Milan.
And while we're here, let's start with the styling of the phone. Now styling-wise, it feels really good, actually. The 21:9 aspect ratio means it's pretty tall and more narrow than most phones, but it feels good and solid thanks to that squared off design. Also, the screen is capable of 120 Hz refresh rate, which means that it can refresh the image on the screen up to 120 times a second for smoother animations and gaming, but it's off by default and I'm actually gonna leave it that way for this video. It's also a 4K display and OLED, so it just looks great, honestly. Now it runs Android 12 and works similarly to any other flagship Android phone, but none of that really matters. And we're gonna stop talking about the phone part of this device for a bit now, because this isn't really meant to be an Android phone per se, and it's not competing with other flagships. Now I've said this before, but it's becoming more and more apparent to me with every new iteration of the Xperia line that Sony, with their very profitable every other business division like TV, Sony PlayStation, headphones, cameras, etc., is using their mobile division to niche down to a group of users that they are more uniquely aimed at catering to, and that's professional videographers, photographers, and even musicians. Now let me show you what I mean, but before we do, you know someone else who's also catering to professional creatives? Today's sponsor, Wirestock.
Wirestock is quite simply the easiest way to sell your photos, vectors, and videos online. You can simply submit your content in seconds, and Wirestock does all the annoying keywording and captioning for you automatically for free. They also automatically submit your content to all of the major marketplaces at once from one account that you can then use to track all of your earnings in a single dashboard. And you even get access to higher royalty rates than you would if you had your own individual account on those marketplaces, as well as increased discoverability too. Best part though? Wirestock only takes a 15% commission with no other fees to use the service, so they only make money when you do. If you're looking to make extra money off your content through royalties, then check them out, again, for free, at the link below.
So this is an interesting little complex in Brooklyn called Industry City. Originally built in 1890, it was a massive manufacturing hub called Bush Terminal and was the largest multi-tenant industrial property in the United States. But in the 60s, as urban manufacturing declined, so did the terminal. In the 70s, they rebranded the area as Industry City, but it wasn't until about the 2010s or so that investment in the area really took off. And now under new owners, it's becoming like a local business hub for startups, especially ones that make things is the idea. There's also now these outdoor areas, event spaces all throughout, restaurants and bars, and food courts, and even markets. One of which I think might be fun to check out with this phone in a bit. Now, before we dive further into like the prosumer aspects of this phone, let's talk about the cameras, because they are actually pretty interesting. So we have 12 megapixel Sony sensors across the board, with an ultra wide, which is a 16mm equivalent, a main, which is a 24mm equivalent, and then we have something very clever that I haven't actually seen done as far as I know by anyone else. We have one sensor for the telephoto that actually has a movable lens to give you an 85mm equivalent, which is like 3.5 times optical, up to 125mm equivalent, which is a 5.2 times optical. Now we saw something similar in the Xperia 1 one Mark III with a 70 to 105mm setup. But the difference is that the Mark III had to choose between 70 or 105 for the positions. Everything in between was a digital zoom. Now with the Mark IV, the lens actually optically moves between 85 and 125, which is actually engineeringly crazy. No? But basically it translates to much clearer shots in between those lengths since it's optically changing and not digitally changing. I could totally see a world in the future where we just have one large sensor for all of the cameras on the back and then optically move the lens in front of it, just like you do with a normal camera with a zoom lens on it. And then that way they could invest more in that one main sensor, maybe make it bigger, instead of having to use an individual sensor and the cost associated with that for every single camera focal length that we kind of do now for the most part. Like how cool would that be, right? Like I want that now. Now, beyond the clever hardware, Sony's Alpha team has been put in charge of the UI, apparently, as well as the software. So we have some clever features carried over from the Sony Alpha cameras, like eye autofocus for humans and animals that works really well, actually, as well as object tracking that also works well. We also have a dedicated shutter button that you can half press to focus, a feature that I've always loved about the Xperias because it makes it feel more like a real camera. And you can easily manually control every aspect of the photo, like ISO, shutter, white balance, and there's very little friction to get to all of those settings. And honestly, there are just more manual settings in general on this phone than I've probably seen on any other phone. But again, Sony's not going for the mainstream user here. So that food hall I mentioned earlier, well, it's this. It's called the Japanese Village. Inside there's the Sunrise Mart, which is a Japanese specialty grocery store. There's a food market with all Japanese vendors inside. There are a number of Japanese restaurants here as well, and there's an area called The Loft above the market that houses specialty Japanese shops, but also Japanese art exhibits that rotate.
Which apparently is closed for plumbing or something right now.
If you're into Japanese culture or food, it's a pretty unique experience in New York City. But now let's talk about video on the phone. For video, you can actually use the new Photo Pro app, which has a basic mode now for photos, which is very handy, but also has a toggle to do video. And this lets you shoot quicker. But you also have the Video Pro app, which gives you a lot more options when shooting. Now you can leave things in auto here, but also manually control everything that you normally would as if it was a proper camera for the most part. You can even easily rack focus, as in move the focus manually from one subject to another, or lock it at a specific distance. And you can also zoom using a slider, which is a lot smoother than other devices pinching to zoom, or even using the volume rocker. And honestly, for me, even just that manual focus, like that level of control, is amazing. It's something I've wanted on every phone, honestly, as far as video is concerned. I do wish that it had focus peaking, which just like highlights what's in focus to make it easier to see, but that would be something that I would like to see them add for sure. Now beyond that, you can take things one step further and use the Cinema Pro app, which is similar to the Video Pro app, but locks the aspect at 21:9 and gives you LUTs that you can use, including one that mimics the Sony Venice, which is their very expensive cinema camera that they have. Now something I do really like that Sony has added to the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV is the fact that you can do 120 FPS shooting on all of the rear cameras in 4K. Now that allows you to have the option to play it back at a lower frame rate to get up to 5 times slow motion, but unlike slow-mo mode on phones that force you to choose that when shooting, this you can decide that after the fact. You can also just drop frames to have it play back normally or adjust the speed anywhere between the two.
It definitely makes for some cinematic looking slow-mo footage of Japanese groceries, for example. Okay, so one of the downsides to coming here on a weekday, it's a Tuesday, everything closes really early. And none of the restaurants are open, they're only open Friday through Sunday. And I'm hungry, and now weirdly craving Japanese. All right, this is one of my favorite Japanese restaurants in New York City, and it's a few blocks from my apartment, and it's called Bozu. I've definitely featured it in other videos, but whatever, I'm craving it now. They make these sushi bombs, they call them, that are essentially pretty sushi mounds, but they're so good. And it also has such a good dimly lit vibe. I'm into it.
And it's a good place to try out the video in low light, of course. Now, besides all the crazy amounts of settings and controls for the cameras, Sony also has added more professional, creative-focused features to the phone. We have a new audio recording app that unfortunately isn't out yet and working on the prototype unit, but the concept is that you can record someone playing guitar and singing, for example, and then send that recording to Sony's cloud processing system to enable a bunch of features that a musician might want, like automatically removing noise and echo. It can even separate the tracks so that the guitar can be one while the voice is another, so that you can edit them separately like you would in a studio. Of course, we have yet to see how well this works, but if it does, it's very clever, I think. Now, there's also an audio jack that can be used for playback, of course, but more importantly for videographers and musicians, you can use it for input and use a better microphone. Similar to how I use this shotgun mic with my Sony Alpha camera to get better audio than the built-in mics on the camera, or even a wireless mic if I'm going to be further from the camera or in an even louder environment. Sony added in some cool features to live stream while playing a game on the phone, or just live stream using the phone's cameras directly to popular live streaming services, and it even has an optional monitor that you can buy that clips on the back of the phone so that you can use the much better quality rear cameras to film yourself. Also, the phone has USB-C video and audio support, so what that means is that you can use a USB-C to HDMI cable to connect to my Sony Alpha camera, for example, and use the phone as a sharper and brighter monitor than the built-in one, even though any phone can be used as a monitor wirelessly with the camera, by the way. And that same USB-C port connected to the camera can use the phone's 5G connectivity to wirelessly transmit the video back to a base, or directly to a live streaming service. Now, you might have noticed in a recent NFL season a different look to some of the shots, which were using Sony Alpha cameras and a wireless transmitter to beam the signal back to the camera truck to get color corrected to match the broadcast. Now, that last part is really important. Okay, first off, the battery died earlier. Around 6 p.m., I got to 5%. At that point, the camera shut off, so I plugged it into a charger, but I grabbed these screenshots for anyone who's curious about my usage and my screen on time and all that. Ignore the chart at the top. There's clearly a glitch with that, but I believe the numbers below that are correct. I took it off the charger at about 7 a.m. this morning, and it lasted till about 6. Now, of course, this is not a normal day. It is a real-world test, and so there was a lot of video usage, etc. I actually think that was a pretty good result, considering. But here is another day that was not a real-world test, so you have something else to compare the usage to. Now, I will say, off the bat, this is the best battery life, even on a pre-production unit, of any Xperia device I've ever used. And even beyond that, it's pretty good. And I can't wait to see what it actually is when the full production unit comes out. Okay, now, I've mentioned throughout this video how the Sony Xperia 1 Mark IV is not really meant for a mainstream audience. And if this whole video and what I've already shown you did not make that clear, the price will. It is $1,600, which is way more expensive than it probably should be, and a lot more expensive than any flagship devices. But remember when I said that wireless transmitter part was important? Well, the NFL was using a setup that included a Sony a7R IV, a Ronin S gimbal, and a monitor and backpack rig for streaming, and that cost $10,000. Now, compared to a broadcast camera setup, that's actually relatively cheap, as referenced by one of the camera operators calling it the, quote, poor man's Steadicam, end quote. Now, for a monitor plus that live streaming backpack setup that he had, you'd pay a lot more than $1,600 for that. And when you compare it to the costs of other accessories that you would normally need to get those features, it's actually relatively cheap. And it just feels like to me that Sony right now at least is happy to just sell a smaller number of devices with a higher margin to those types of customers. The professionals who actually have a budget to spend on camera equipment, and this just falls into that. Now, beyond that, I do really appreciate that Sony is just kind of being like, screw the iPhones and Samsung of the world, and we're not gonna go after any of that market, really. We're gonna go after a niche of creator-focused users. And with every iteration of the Xperia line so far, I feel like they're getting closer and closer to that being a viable option and a viable choice. For me, the price and the fact that I still kind of want to use it as a separate device to take photos and use it as a B camera right now, at least for my workflow, I'd probably be better off with an actual Sony camera like the Sony ZV-1 or the Sony ZV-E10, both of which would be less than half the price of this phone. So I don't think it's a compelling enough offering for me just yet. But there's a lot of things I do actually like about this device other than the price. So I'm excited to see what Mark V brings or some other Pro devices bring to the table. We'll see. Let me know what you guys think though in the comments below. Always appreciate hearing from you guys. Also, let me know what you guys thought of this video in the comments as well. Appreciate that. And if you like what you saw, subscribe and ding the bell so you get notified when I do new videos. As always, regardless, thanks for watching.